My eyes have gone to the dogs. This looked like a vibe. How weird and interesting is that? 100% viscose. The Chinese lied to me. You're not always going to win. Oh, thank you for gracing me with your presence. So now in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about vintage labels. And I have quite a few examples of vintage labels. And so if you are a thrifter and you are on the lookout for something, then you're in good company, because that's all I do. I happened upon this amazing YouTuber that talked about, she showed labels and she showed from what era they came from, so that you can know what to look out for. Your vintage tags and labels, they were very, very different to what we see today. Today's labels are very plain. The labels from the times of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they were fun, they were cursive, they were colorful. The label represented the energy of the designer. Something else to look out for are zip codes. We call them postal codes in our country, but you would not find a zip code on any item before 1963. They didn't exist. Okay, look for items that are made in the 1960s, USA, 1960s or earlier, where they'll have, okay, if you want to know if an item is from the 1960s or earlier, if it's got a USA label, and then underneath it, it's got the city, it's got California, it's got Boston, European cities, it would have Paris, it would have Italy, Chicago, Hawaii. These are all pre-1960 labels. Anything that's got made in China is post-1990. So any label that you see has made in China, you know for a fact that that garment was made after 1990. If your item doesn't have a care label, in other words, it doesn't tell you how to iron or how to wash, it means it is pre-1971, because only from 1971 did it compulsory to put care labels onto garments. I'm sure you've all run into this when you've bought vintage. The sizing was different. A size 14 in a vintage style would be a medium now. It's very, very confusing when you buy vintage. The sizing is completely off. So always know when you're buying something vintage that rather buy 2 sizes bigger than you are, because we are almost, the vintage label sizes are definitely at least 2 sizes smaller than today's modern sizes. I have no idea. It's not a conspiracy. I just think they're trying to make women feel better about themselves. If you see a half size, so if it says 8.5 or 14.5, they only did that between 1940 and 1970. And it was mostly more for petite women or for girls, younger girls, or short girls. If you get odd sizing, in other words, you get an 11 or a 13 or a 7 or a 5, we're not talking about shoes, we're actually talking about clothing, then that was pre-1980. Anything that says one size fits all was made from the 1980s onwards. Seams are interesting, and I'm going to try and put as many examples up as I can. So anything before the 1950s, seams were not finished. Sometimes they were just cut in a way to make sure that they didn't unravel. So they didn't have sergers or overlockers to be able to finish off the seams. Those machines hadn't been invented yet. If you see a pinked seam, I'll show you an example. That is from the 1950s or pre-1950s. If the seam is serged or has been overlocked, it's post-1960. Obviously, there's no foolproof way to know that something is 100% vintage, especially if it doesn't have a label, because some items were homemade and still are homemade, and some people just don't serge the edges, or they might use a zigzag. So in that way, you might think, oh, this is older than what it is. But beware of homemade items, because they can sometimes look like they are vintage if you're looking at the seams itself and the way seams have been finished off. Your hook and eye closure, that was from the 1900s to the 1920s, unless it was homemade. Snaps were pre-1950s. Your metal zippers, you only got between 1930 and 1965. The plastic zipper started coming in after 1965. A side zipper was only used in the 1930s to 1955. So from these things, you can start telling, okay, I've got a side zipper on this item. It's definitely vintage. It's got its label. And then you'll know, okay. And it wasn't homemade. Then I can date it between 1930 and 1955, when it was happening. That's when side zippers were used in fashion. Back zippers were used mostly from the 1955s onwards. Let's move on to, so we've talked about tags and we've talked about seams and zippers. Let's talk about the materials that were used. The material, we've already chatted about polyester. Polyester today is not the same as the polyester back then. Fabric labels. If there is no fabric label, in other words, it doesn't tell you what it's made of, it's pre-1960s. If it has a fabric label, then have a look for the wool mark. The 100% wool mark was after 1964. The 60% wool mark was after 1971. And the 50% wool mark was after 1999. There were types of fabric then that you don't get now. So if you have a garment that has any of these fiber contents in them, it means it came from a certain time and date. There was something called Quiana nylon. It's from 1968 to 1970. Acrylic was always after 1950. You didn't get any acrylic before 1950. Dacron polyester was from 1958 to 1970. Lycra, if the item says lycra on the label, then it is after 1959. In vintage items, your acrylics, your polyesters, your nylon, these fibers were high fashion in the 1950s. So if you have an item of clothing that says acrylic or polyester or nylon, and it's a vintage item, if they have certain percentages of that, and it looks vintage, and it doesn't have a care label, then the possibilities are that it was made sometime from 1950. If it has no care label, but it's made of acrylic, polyester, or nylon, then your vintage item was made sometime between 1950 and 1971, because in 1971 was when the care labels came out. Pre-1950s, there were no polyester, acrylic, nylon items. So if it has no care label on it, and it's made of wool, cotton, silk, cashmere, or angora, then it is pre-1950s. Most of these items, most of these types of natural fibers would have been combined with a polyester and nylon from 1950 onwards. So if there's no care label, then, and it's made purely with natural fabric, it's probably from the 1950s and before. These items were always high quality. They wrinkle very, very easily. If you want to test to see if something is a natural fiber, you can do the burn test, and apparently it smells like burning hair. I wouldn't recommend it. If your item is made with velvet, we're looking at the 1990s. Now, there were different styles. So the next category we can talk about is the different styles of the different eras. The silhouettes, the collars, the lengths. If you can't really work out when it was manufactured or made, if there aren't any labels to tell you, or material labels or care labels, then you can look at some of these to get some ideas of what era it was made in. In the 1920s and the 1960s, clothing items back then were very rectangular. The silhouette was very rectangular. The 1930s and the 1970s, you see 40 years between everything, they emphasized the natural soft curves of a woman. The 1940s and the 1980s, we got the strong shoulders and the cinched in waist. So you got those shoulder pads and then the polyester. If your item has shoulder pads, it is either from the 1980s, the 1990s, or the 1940s. So if it's made with natural fiber and it has shoulder pads, then it's the 1940s. If it's made with acrylic or polyester and it's got shoulder pads, the chances are that it was made in the 1980s or 1990s. Madonna! If you find an underarm fabric, so in those days they called it an underarm liner. I've never seen one, but if you do see it in a garment, it is pre-1950s. A nappy for the underarms, you could say. Strap holders were pre-1960s, so those were there to keep your straps in place, and usually studs were used to keep everything in place. Pre-1965, women wore slips. So if a garment is quite transparent and it's made with polyester and acrylics, even if it's made with cotton or natural fibers, if the fabric is very transparent and hasn't got any inner lining, it could be pre-1965 because every woman wore a slip. So I guess you could say that any clothing that has a lining in it was made from 1965 onwards. Anything without a lining was made before 1965. Watching this YouTuber, she was so cool because she actually said, you can dress vintage and not necessarily have the actual vintage items. Because she said you can have a look on Pinterest. You can type in 1920s fashion and it will give you a whole bunch of pictures that you can look at. And then you can make notes on what was 1920s fashion. And then you can go to the thrift store and you can find yourself those silhouettes or those patterns. Let's say certain eras had polka dots and certain eras had sailor collars or lace collars or certain puffy sleeves. She made a list, and I'm going to put them here for you now, that you can, if you, for instance, have to go to some sort of do that's a 1940s party, then the list here I have for you that you would look for when you go thrifting, and you could then put your own outfit together that would be very 1940s. Okay, so we're going to start with the 1900s to the 1910s. This is so cool. It's like such a little adventure. I'm going to see how many pictures I can put up for you. 1900s to 1910s, they had high necklines, very high. They had lace detail, Edwardian blouses, they had silk, they had natural fabrics. They loved the color brown, very earth tones, probably used charcoal and white. Floor length skirts, hourglass shape, high waists, muted pastel colors, long sleeves. They also had short sleeves. They used the color navy and the fabrics were mostly made of cotton. Also had a puffed bishop sleeve and a sailor collar. So that was the 1900s to the 1910s. Then we have the 1920s. So if you want to make an outfit and you're going to a party with the 1920s, this is what you're going to need to look out for. They had a drop waist. They had sweaters. They used a lot of beads, embroidery. They had the T-strap heels. Loved using metallics and silks and velvet. Their colors were very moody. They had a lot of sleeveless outfits, short sleeves, V-necks, and they made use of belts. The 1930s. Cap sleeves. They used the colors of burgundy, peach, gray, mother of pearl buttons, crepe and silk and satin. They had gathered bodices. They used geometric shapes in their fashion. Wide leg trousers, tailored blazers, dusty pastel colors, puff sleeves, sheer material and ruffles, flare cut, midi, maxi skirts, sweetheart necklines. It was the 1930s. On to the 1940s. So you've got your 1940s party. So here is what you need to go find in a thrift store somewhere. Or A-line skirts, the sheath skirts, padded shoulders, much like the 1980s and 90s, red lips, military green, red, white, and blue colors. They used wool, cotton, sweetheart necklines, and square shapes. Denim, most of the items had pockets. The 1950s, full skirts, nipped waists, polka dots, cat's eye glasses, pastels, bright reds, aqua. They used taffeta, velvet, tulle, they had petticoats. They loved their capris, which has just come back, cap sleeves, halter necks, sleeveless blouses, Peter Pan collars, boat necks, sweetheart necklines, and heels started to become a big thing. The last one I'm going to cover is the 1960s. So by now, the manufacturers were inundated with polyester, acrylic, nylon. So let's see what they started making. The colors of the 1960s were brown, orange, and yellow. They also had high contrasts in colors, drop waist, mini skirts, mini skirts, bikinis, tights, boots, berets, sleeves, under sleeveless. So they would have like a little vest and then sleeves and a long sleeve shirt underneath. Collars, under collarless tops. And the other colors were pink and green. Brown was big and orange. How many had a truly 1960s kitchen? Brown, orange, yellow. Even the crockery was like that. So that's all the research I've been doing. What an interesting trip to see the artistry behind what we're wearing, especially regarding if you find a vintage item. I think vintage is going to become rarer and rarer, and fast fashion is what, in the next 10 years, that's what you're going to find in thrift shops. And vintage will become very expensive to purchase. They made it better than ever again. I think the people, in some ways, in those days, they were hardy, their values were high, and quality mattered. So let me know what you found. Have you found any cool vintage items that have you found anything with these sort of labels that I mentioned today? Has anything I've said to you today helped you identify your vintage item and where it came from and what year it was made? Hope to see you soon on the next one, and I have no idea what fashion adventure we will have then, but hope to see you there. I've been on a journey of discovering the art of clothing making. I'm here to teach you how to thrift sensibly. You guys know I love vintage, so now let me show you a proper vintage tag. Have a look so that you seal it into your brains. It's been embroidered on, and it's got like a weird this. It doesn't have a size 10, 8, whatever stuff. It's like cotton on, but it's like gone rogue. Cotton on, gone rogue. Don't be fooled. Just because it's made at cotton on doesn't mean it's all cotton. What to thrift, how to find quality, what different materials are and what you want and what blends you want, and why polyester from the 1950s and 60s, for instance, this dress is so much better, and we still want these, than the polyester from nowadays. Have a look at this one. This is another vintage piece from Topics. For goodness sake, when last was Topics around? They say if you really want to see if something's vintage, it doesn't have a label, a care label. It just has this. Tells you how much around that bustier area, and there's nothing else. It's vintage for you. I'll be trying this one on, but as vintage as it is, look. The pleats are still in it. The pleats. How? After so many washes, are the pleats still there? Because it's polyester, and it's proper polyester. Yes, sirree, Bob. Look at the front of that. Woo! Can't wait to show you that. This is definitely polyester, but this is what I was trying to show you. Look at the pleats, still there. Look at this cute little frill. It looks like it's a bit of a drop waist, maybe. This was an old machine making this dress. I can tell you right now, even though this is polyester, it feels incredible. Dainty. Look at the way, this is an absolute direct, good stitching. Look at the line. Look at the way they made a plan to make the patterns match. As I said, look at the zigzag here. And how on earth they got this to stay. This is polyester, guys, and it is amazing. These sleeves are perfect. They've been taken in a little bit, but they're not tight taken in. It's like a tennis dress. You can almost... Nah. This is gold. This is vintage gold. Wow. To hand stitching. Look at that. There you can see them even bigger there. Hand stitching the hem. Incredible. This vintage. Vintage. Look at that. I don't know what it says, but it looks cool. And all it has on it is 38 or 97 centimeter. It does have the care instructions on the back, but I mean, this is a tag of authenticity. Vintage, baby, vintage. If I have not convinced you yet, stop shopping new. With the sides. See that? Look at that cool little, the way they sewed it with French seams. Sure, you're a winner. Vintage label, polyester as it comes. It's been beautifully made though. Look at that. Straight lines. It's got these lacquer cool, 80s. Why do people want to look more boxy? I'm telling you it's going to come back though. This dress is going to come back in style. This weird, wacky, crazy colors and flappy things. Mark my words. Fashion goes in circles.